Welcome back to our discussion, The Technology Challenge of Great Power Competition, sponsored by Leidos here on Federal News Network. My guest today is Jim Carlini. He's the Chief Technology Officer of Leidos. I'm your questioner and moderator, Tom Temin. And before the break, we were talking about artificial intelligence as a key enabler for so many of the responses that the nation will need in this great power competition we've been discussing. I want to get to the other big one, or one of the other big ones, namely cybersecurity. And cyberspace, has become a domain really for some years now for the Defense Department. And what do you see as the big cyber challenges coming next? I mean, we have a zero trust architecture mandate from the White House, but it's a bigger question than that, isn't it?
It is. It's a bigger question, and it, as I mentioned earlier, it really touches every part of the federal government, every part of the nation. And in fact, we know that in the great power competition, you might think of it as sort of the front lines because there's so much activity there now. Just in July, the U.S. government attributed some targeting of industrial control systems to China, and also released a statement about attributing the recent Microsoft Exchange server exploitation to China. So there's a lot of activity that hits home. It's a big technological challenge, right? So you mentioned zero trust is one of the things that's being pushed out of the White House at the very highest levels. And zero trust basically is a different way of architecting systems that assume that potentially somebody's already in my system, and I can't just keep them out with a big firewall. So it's a different way of architecting things. And it's, in a sense, it's an admission of, we really have to look at cyber very differently. In addition to that, there is a confluence of artificial intelligence, which we talked about earlier, with cyber. So the art of cyber, both offense and defense, is something that is being accelerated by the addition of artificial intelligence. So that's another area of intense research. So for us, we've been, as I talked about previously, anticipating those needs, and from our perspective, trying to help our customers figure out, how do I adopt zero trust? Where is the best technology out in the commercial world? So for us, we have something called a zero trust proving ground, where we can do that for our customers. They can see how it works. And we're also bringing AI into zero trust to have better algorithms for determining how to manage a zero trust resilient architecture. And then we're also in general using AI with cyber to more quickly come up with better defensive applications, and to really counter the advanced threats, those that come from state actors that are really very, very good and tend to really hide in networks, and they're more difficult to see. So that's where we've been going in cyber. Very important area, not just for defense, but for the entire nation.
And just to follow up on that, as the Defense Department deploys more automated and autonomous types of platforms, and they sort of go back and forth on the speed at which they're deploying those, but the zero trust needs to operate not just in the traditional systems of human users on networks going to data and applications, but also on non-human autonomous systems where the commands might be a bot or might be something that's not initiated by a human at a keyboard. And so do you need to bake zero trust into those types of systems so that that system will know, yes, this is a legitimate command and that one is not?
That is absolutely right. At its core, zero trust is a philosophy. It's not a thing you can go buy, right? It's a way you architect systems, whether they be manned, unmanned, combinations, whether they be information systems, or whether they be things like derivatives of what the DoD calls JADC2. If I'm going to tie everything together, I need to make sure that tying of everything together is resilient. And I need to make sure that architecture, again, zero trust as an architecture, has those same principles where I'm testing everything, I don't trust anything, and I'm constantly making sure that the things that are touching my system, my network, those data, those applications are all trusted, but I test them, I verify. So absolutely, it touches all sorts of systems and architectures.
And JADC2 is a good way to transition into the question on space, the latest domain for the military. There's a new service for space-related issues, and that's also crosses civilian and military lines in a profound way. And it's also one where a lot of commercial technology is coming in and replacing what used to be government exclusive territory. So it's a complicated situation up there that we can't see, but we know it's up there. What are your thoughts on the technological challenges in the space domain part of the great powers competition?
Well, they are vast as they are in other domains. I'd say the other attribute, you're right, the commercialization is obviously a big difference these days than what it was certainly many years ago. But the other thing that's happening, and you're seeing this, is this weaponization of space. That China is clearly seeking to establish their leadership, and including weaponization. We saw just recently what was an apparent ASAT test from the Russians, creating a large amount of debris. So in addition to it being a very complex and now intertwined with commercial entities, it's also a contested domain. So now it's a fighting domain. Over the next decade, I think you're going to see, and you're seeing now, a lot of activity to grapple with how we deal with that and how we deal with both leveraging the commercial world, but also making sure we can secure space in a way that it can be used for both commercial and military purposes across the world.
Because I imagine a lot of the assets deployed in space are done so on the assumption that nobody's going to shoot at this thing or nobody's going to try to zap out this. But we now know by some recent events that's not the case. So I imagine that in future space requirements from industry, whether it's the launch item vehicle itself or all of the supporting systems, a big integration job, by the way, that this hardness will need to be a requirement they're going to have to add.
Yeah, exactly. So it gets back to the comment I made earlier about resilience, and just to double click on that a little bit more. So that resilience can take the form, a lot of different forms, right? One is, we talk about cyber hardening all the time, but resilience again is just like a supply chain, can be architectural as well. So I can have an architecture in space that is intrinsically more resilient just because of the way I construct it. I have far more satellites instead of a few that might be more vulnerable. Those kinds of things you're going to see happening as we go forward in space, but you're also going to see it in other domains. So we're seeing it in cyber, we're seeing it in space. We're living through today supply chain challenges that are highlighting some of the danger of not having resilience baked into your supply chain, whether it be for the homeland or for military purposes. So resilience in supply chain is something I think we'll see a lot more of as well for our customers.
Yeah, and just sticking with the space example there, then 500 CubeSats might be more resilient and more flexible than a single $1 billion satellite that you launch and hope for the best.
It certainly would be many more satellites to have to deal with than one. That's for sure.
But they can at least share the load maybe if something happens to one of them. And what about the hypersonics? I mean, I don't know whether Leidos is in that domain, but it gets to another one of these challenges that we see the adversaries rolling out and demonstrating. And the United States is not quite there yet from what we can tell, at least publicly.
Yeah, we're very much in that domain at Leidos, and obviously it's been in the press a lot, the Chinese hypersonic capabilities. It's a very important development and a very important area. So the combination of speed, maneuverability, and altitude of hypersonic weapons really makes them potent weapons and demands both an offensive and a defensive look at how we deal with that. Right? So we're involved on the offensive side. We're building the common hypersonic glide body at our Dynetics site down in Huntsville, Alabama. So we're involved in building the nation's premier offensive capability, but we're also looking at the defensive response as well. So we're part of industry competing to build IR systems in space that would be able to detect and track hypersonic vehicles. So we're involved in both sides of it. Very technologically challenging problem, and one where, frankly, we need to move with speed in order to make sure we're competing in the hypersonics realm.
And I want to get back to the supply chain too, something you mentioned just a moment ago. And so far, the attempts to secure the supply chain they've done some good, but it puts a lot of emphasis on attestation by the suppliers that they have cybersecurity controls in place. But I sense that the supply chain security, supply chain assurance issue is bigger than that. Tell us what you think.
Yeah, I think it is. I think cyber is only one aspect of supply chain resilience, right? So There are many others. There's counterfeiting. There's the architectural level of how you actually architect the supply chain, where you have to avoid single points of failure and architectures that are intrinsically not resilient, where a critical part of your supply chain is dependent on an unreliable source, for instance. So it's not just a cyber problem, it is an architectural problem, and both have to be grappled with simultaneously.
And let's talk about the general need for speed. This is something, this very expression you're seeing coming from some of the administration documents. Recently, GSA said it would modernize a lot of systems, demonstrating that the government can move at the need of speed. How will speed play an important part in this, and what manifestation will it take in the great power competition as the nation moves ahead?
I think it's of the utmost importance, frankly. So, for the first time in my career, or at least as more than any other time, some of our leadership, especially in the DoD, they're ringing alarm bells about speed, right? So, General Hyten recently talked about China's pace of military development being stunning. Just the speed at which they're moving out. Last year, our Air Force Chief of Staff, General Brown, released a paper called Accelerate, Change, or Lose. Pretty provocative title, right? And then recently, Air Force Secretary Kendall said we're being more effectively challenged militarily than at any other time in our history. So the alarm bells are going off, and that is all about being able to move very rapidly from this point forward. So we need to innovate with speed, and we need to do that across the board, across all the domains that we've been talking about today.
Yeah, we need to innovate, and we need to also be able to turn on a dime, probably fair to say.
Exactly, which means we need to be strategic and in some cases make some hard choices. But that's part of the challenge I think our customers are grappling with now. We in industry have to help give them those choices and make sure that they're real and they're not false choices.
Well, fascinating stuff. I want to thank today's guest is Jim Carlini, the Chief Technology Officer at Leidos. I'm Tom Temin. You've been listening to Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, please visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search Leidos.